We acknowledge and honor the indigenous people of the area, the Arapaho, the Cheyenne, the Ute, and Sioux, including traditional custodians, elders past, present, and future, and of all our plant and animal relatives of the land in which we live and are nourished by each day. In late July of 2020, I rose early as the sun was still coming up in order to go on pilgrimage. The pilgrimage was from Greeley, a 4-hour journey to southeast Colorado, to a site called the Sand Creek Massacre. The Sand Creek Massacre is not only a tragic historic event, its legacy is alive and present in the memories, lineage, and stories, and in the trauma and healing of its Cheyenne and Arapaho descendants. Memorialization of the massacre has significance as well to some of the descendants of its U.S. military participants, as well as those who come to pay respects, like myself. The Cheyenne and Arapaho have always had a sacred and spiritual way of life. They believe that all of creation has a spiritual connection. The land, plants, animals, wind, water, and people. The tribes believe that even speaking of the massacre is sacred. They consider the massacre site forever hallowed because of the spirits and the blood of the victims are intermingled with the raw earth. The Central Plains, which stretch from the Missouri River to the Rockies, were home to thousands of Plain Indians. They adopted the horse for hunting buffalo, the main source of the material culture and food. In winter, certain locations along creeks and rivers offered firewood, shelter from the bitter winds, and drinking water. Big Sandy Creek was such a place. People of many tribes paused here while traveling the Smoky Hill Lodgepole Trail. In 1821, European Americans began to cross the Central Plains in greater numbers, first on the Santa Fe Trail, which follows the Arkansas River, and later along the Oregon Trail, which followed the Platte River. Some tribes saw the newcomers as trespassers in their sacred hunting grounds. And so, tension and violence resulted. The U.S. government sought peace through treaties which acknowledged the tribes as independent domestic nations. In 1851, Fort Laramie Treaty defined the Plains tribes' territory. It promised them protection and annuities, provisions, in return for safe passages by travelers through the Indian lands. The treaty, as often is the case, did not achieve lasting peace. In the late 1850s, prospectors struck gold in the Rocky Mountains, realizing that Indian lands might include other rich material resources the U.S. government reneged on the 1851 treaty. The new Fort Wise Treaty of 1861 required the Cheyenne and Arapaho to succeed all their previously agreed territories except a very small reservation. 6 Cheyenne and 4 Arapaho chiefs signed, and many of the other 150 refused. And despite the discord and the shallow representation, Congress created the Colorado Territory in 1861. Only a few months later, we know and remember that the Civil War began. The U.S. Army withdrew most of its regulars from the frontier to serve back east. In 1862, Congress passed the Homestead and Pacific Railroad Acts, which eventually led to more Western migration. Colonel John Chivington, a Civil War hero, commanded the troops of the Colorado Military District. Chivington, who had great political ambitions, reportedly said, "It is right or honorable to use any means under God's heaven to kill Indians." In the spring of 1864, he ordered tracts of 4 Cheyenne villagers. He ordered attacks on 4 Cheyenne villages. And his regime killed Peace Chief Lean Bear. Plains warriors retaliated, and some Indian leaders appealed for peace in a conference at Camp Weld, near Denver, with Territorial Governor John Evans and Chivington. Those Indians declared and desired peace were told to report to Fort Lyons. Many did, and then they encamped at Sandy Creek. The day I chose to go to Sand Creek Massacre National Historic Park was an unusual day in the summer of a lot of over 100-degree temperatures. This was a day in the 80s. It was cloud covered, and the clouds gave a spectacular view as I traversed the eastern part of Colorado. When I arrived near the site, it was really a desolate corner without much agriculture, wild grasses, few cows, but it was pretty sparse. And as I parked my car, I realized that I was not the only one who was there. In fact, the car next to me was a little van, and in that van was a whole crowd of people, which surprised me in these COVID-19 pandemic days. But as the group exited their van, I realized something special about them, because in their arms was a small statue, and the statue was of the Madonna and Child. And I was surprised by this, but realized that perhaps I was not going to be the only pilgrim on this day. And so I got up the courage to talk to them, and in fact, they were on pilgrimage, and in fact, the Madonna had traveled all the way from Argentina, as she was passed from group to group, as she was herself on pilgrimage around the world in 2020. And as we spoke we realized that we were in a sacred space and that we needed to further prepare ourselves for the news and the experience that we were about to encounter. On Tuesday morning, the 29th of November, the squaw came into the lodge where we were eating breakfast and said there was a heap of buffalo coming. On November 29th, 1864, U.S. Colonel John Shivelton and 700 volunteer troops attacked the encampment of the Cheyenne and the Arapaho along Sand Creek. The tremendous approach of the horses galloping towards the camp at dawn sent hundreds fleeing from their teepees. Many were shot and killed outside of their thresholds. And while the warriors fought back, escapees frantically ran upstream and dug themselves into the sandy banks of the Sand Creek. Only later, for days after, to be hunted down and shot, often with cannonballs bombarding them. In the bloody aftermath, some of the soldiers manipulated the dead bodies, taking with them as booty genitalia, and looted the camp of all the material treasures that were there. Some soldiers came back and burnt the village and its contents till there was nothing left. Among the slain were chiefs, and amongst the village were men and women and children. It is said that when the fighting stopped, over 230 Cheyenne and Arapaho, including 13 council members, were murdered, most of them women and children and elderly. The U.S. Army casualties mounted to 18 dead and 70 wounded. And among those chiefs who died that day or in the next days, were War Bonnet, White Antelope, Lone Bear, Yellow Wolf, Big Man, Bear Man, Spotted Crow, Bear Robe, Left Hand. Those who had diligently worked to negotiate peace, including those who had traveled east on the arduous journey to Washington, D.C., where they received the American flag as a peace flag. The massacre devastated generations of Cheyenne and Arapaho people. The deaths of so many Cheyenne chiefs disrupted tribal governance, and surviving chiefs like Black Kettle lost credibility. Tribes lost much traditional knowledge, Families lost providers. Children lost parents. The massacre polarized the American public. In Denver, crowds cheered when the returning soldiers displayed human trophies. Their brutality appalled others. The U.S. Army ordered an immediate investigation. Congress would order 2 more. Company Commander Captain Silas Soule and Lieutenant Joseph Kramer, who ordered their men to stand down, provided written accounts that shocked national and military leaders. Colonel John Shivelton gave a different account, which the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the Civil War rejected. In the 1865 Little Arkansas Treaty, the U.S. government took responsibility for the massacre and promised reparations to survivors. The promised reparations have never been filled. What responsibility do we have to those who camped on November 29, 1864, along the Big Sand Creek?